Welcome this morning to the third panel in the Sustainability and Environment series, the panel on economics. Brent Wooten, our moderator, is ignore the year in your bulletin. He's much younger than that. He's a Trent person from 2006, not the 1990s. Which seemed distressingly young to me when I read it anyway, but that was, Brent's the, I've spent the weekend feeling like an underachiever, right? You know, but Brent's the Director of Applied Research at Fleming College, and he's also the Senior Scientist in the college's Alternative Wastewater Treatment Center. His research interests include the design and functioning of treatment wetlands, and also the application of alternative technologies in rural and small communities. Brent is the chair of the Water Technology Acceleration Project, and he's also a member of the United Nations Wastewater Task Force. So Brent, a great pleasure to have you here, and thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Delighted to be here, and I'm thrilled so many people decided to give up their sunny Saturday morning to join us for what I think will be a very engaging session. I'm conscious of the fact that it's 5 men up here, and it brings to mind something I was reading recently in Scientific American. I don't know if you've heard that they're about to perfect brain transplants. It's sort of leading edge, and what they discovered is that the cost for doing a brain transplant on a man versus a woman is significantly different. It costs about twice as much to do a brain transplant on a man than a woman, and I was curious to know why that was, and turns out the reason is that in the case of a woman, it's been used. No, all kidding aside, I think these guys actually do know something, and we hope that you'll enjoy the day. We're going to start out. I'm going to introduce. We're going to introduce them, and then we're going to individually start off the session with short talks, and then it's my intention to open it to the floor. So please pay attention, so you'll have brilliant questions, and then we'll go back and forth, and they'll have a second round to say some things. I'm gonna start off with a few thoughts of my own, starting with a nice blank screen. I recently had to give a talk to the Canadian Network of Asset Managers in Toronto, and I was asked to talk about innovation, and it's a word that I really don't like much. It's overused, and I was asked to say something innovative about innovation. So I did some reading and tried to find something novel about this, and so I'm gonna just share a couple of concepts that I hope will set the stage a little bit and provoke some thinking. So we have a remote clicker, which I'm told works. Yeah, there we go. So the first concept. Does anybody know who that guy is? No. That's Herbert Simon. He won the Nobel Prize in 1978 for saying that humans are irrational, basically. I guess nobody come up with that idea before. He's an economist, political scientist, and he wrote that in the real world, no one has full knowledge about every possible alternative and its various outcomes. Reality, therefore, is characterized by uncertainty. In turn, this is caused by limited information, but also by our limited thinking capability. Doesn't sound too, earth-shattering, but the reason why this matters, because he's an economist, and why this matters is that was shocking to traditional economists who basically had the assumption that market actors are always rational, that we have perfect information, right? So or we have enough, right? And that we're pretty smart. We know what to do with that information. And so therefore all of our outcomes, all of our decisions are, for the most part, rational. But he basically turned that on his head and said, you know, we don't have enough information and we're not that bright, as bright as we think we are. So probably most of our thinking is pretty irrational. So if you're going to build models of economic theory, you're going to do it differently based on what kind of assumptions you have. So another guy by the name of Trent, point it, had this idea, well, he wrote a paper, and he's a Swedish intellectual, and he explains it this way, that in the metaphor of a cave, and this isn't the cave you may have heard of from ancient Greece, although it's similar, but basically that the cave model makes the metaphorical assumption that all innovation actors are housed in a dark cave. We all live in a dark cave. So this is building on Simon's idea that we have limited information. So the rock surrounding that cave represents a lack of information, a lack of thinking capability. The cave entrance provides a restricted view of the outside world, and since we're talking about economics in our session, I'm going to refer to in that context. So we're talking buyers, suppliers, competitors, governments, municipalities, stakeholders, consumers, etc. Beyond this, but hidden from the actors are multiple factors that are affecting or could affect our innovation processes, our thinking. These are things that could influence us. In the business world, this would be anything from potential customers to succeeding in business and so on. And the X factor that could decide success. And in the case of sustainability, same thing, the X factor for leading to sustainable practices. And it's also assumed that in this model of thinking that these would not be core traditional economic theories. These would be outside of that. So the good news is that the entrance to the cave can be widened so that innovators, or all of us, can allow more information to get to us. And the way to do that is really to be open to more information, to more knowledge. So we're not stuck in irrational darkness, we might say. And some companies take this very seriously. Siemens, for example, spends millions and millions of dollars on sophisticated searches for getting more information. And I think the most sophisticated businesses, and I think success and sustainability comes from being open to know more knowledge and more information. So, I'm just, one last slide. There we go. Oh, nope. There we go, that's good. That's it. This is the last time I'm going to use. So the concept that Frank Callias leaves us with is something that the Germans called Umwelt, and it loosely translates into surroundings or environment. That we need to have be open to that to the Umwelt, to our environment, our surroundings, and to be receptive to information. And while universities are centers of knowledge and information and sharing, I think sometimes we can all find ourselves in a dark cave without really realizing it. These are the kind of conversations I try to have with folks in the business world and engineers and others to sort of say, you think you have everything, all the information you need, but what is the information you don't have, the knowledge that is going to lead to more rational decision making? So that's how I wanted to frame this morning's session, and hopefully we can So with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers and get right to hearing from them. So first up, I'm going to introduce everybody first, and then we'll go one at a time. Our first speaker is going to be Ray Dart. Ray is the director of a business administration program. He's received Excellence in Education Award for Promotion of Sustainable Practices in 2009-2010. And his research focuses on organizational community interaction, environmental, social, international development, community business, community learning processes, innovation, there's that word, strategic development, and improving effectiveness. After Ray, we're going to have David Patterson. David started his degree in '66, it says. He is the chair and CEO of Northwater Capital, which provides asset management to institutional investors. As the company's founder, Mr. Patterson is respected at the executive level of many of the largest pension plans in the world for his adeptness in creating solutions to seemingly intractable investment problems. Mr. Patterson and the Drain Pattersons established the first endowed chair at Trent, and this was the Kenneth Mark Drain Chair in Ethics. After David, we will have another David Newhouse. David is Onondaga from the Six Nations of the Grand River community. He was the first principal of this new college, Peter Zosif College, and has been chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies since 1993. He's also an associate professor in the Business Administration program. And he was co-chair of the Trent Aboriginal Education Council for 10 years. He also has a recent book out entitled Aboriginal Knowledge for Economic Development. After David, we will have Azaf Zohar, who will wrap up in the first round. Azaf is a chair of the Masters in Sustainable Studies program, an associate professor in business here. His research examines the processes and enabling conditions that promote the translation of visions and missions of sustainability into successful organizing strategies and actions. He's played a leadership role in introducing sustainability in both undergraduate and graduate programs at Trent. And he's the founding national chair of Canadian Academics for Peace in the Middle East, an organization governed and driven by academics, committed to academic freedom and integrity, and to promoting nuanced and academically rigorous debates on issues in the Middle East.
I'd just like to add that I've always wanted to be a David.
It can be an honor, David. So with that, we'll get right to the talks. And starting off is
hello, I'm going to actually start with a little Trent story, not related to the talk. So in winter, during the Winter Olympics, I was fortunate enough to be with a group of Peterborough friends, Trent friends from my time here, in Toronto on a kind of a binge. And the morning after this was the morning of the gold medal game, the gold medal men's hockey game. And so a bunch of us Trent people sidled up to the hotel bar, which was open at 6 o'clock in the morning. If you recall, they were able to for the gold medal game. And sitting beside us was this other couple who were right there, and it turns out that they were Trent people too, so who else would be at the bar at 6 o'clock in the morning, drinking beer to watch the gold medal hockey game, but more of us Trent alum. Okay, I don't think I want to, so every topic like this obviously is like constellational, very, very multifaceted. I'm not going to talk about economics, I don't think at all, but more opportunity. And the way that looking at sort of more sustainable social and community environments, the ways that community building and community serving are actually evolving. It's very, very interesting business differentiators as ways of businesses to become successful. And thinking about that as another way, in a kind of a broader context for where I think our discussion might go, are just looking at sustainability almost like that dialectically, like the pendulum. The pendulum doesn't quite come back to the same place that it swung from. And that is about the unusual and unexpected ways that some of the really quite shitty, unsustainable currents in contemporary society are creating opportunities for organizations and particularly businesses that we might not have ever really guessed were there. So the context for what I kind of like to emphasize, I'm going to bring up a couple of examples, one very local that I've been talking about in the Peterborough context and one much more international. So, you know, we got, in terms of sustainability, a bunch of the standard context things that I think we know really, really well. Concerns about sustainability because of things like high volume, standardized production, just too many goods and services, the whole McDonaldization piece. We have what, to me, is at least as disturbing is the way things that all of this like consumption mania connects to that concept getting talked about a lot more called affluenza, which is to me one of those very, very amazing, what are they called, neologisms, new words, right? Combining affluence and influenza. Oliver James, who coined this and researches about Brexit in the UK, has correlated the growth in income in the UK, the growth in wealth in the UK, tracks almost inversely with the self-reports of kind of happiness and life satisfaction, noting that from a mental health perspective, affluence is actually becoming a more significant mental health issue than poverty, which is mind-blowing if you think about that. The third piece to connect to is stuff I hope everybody's seen on YouTube and online called The Story of Stuff. And that is just that kind of massive macro consumption scale, economy scale piece like that. So we have those as sort of major currents where sustainability, sustainable business, sustainable organizational practices come as a context. Just wanted to throw in that those currents create opportunities for countercurrents. And I think in the tax talk yesterday, we got something about the way that networked economies potentially may dematerialize things and opportunities to actually kind of descale and relocalize things in networked organizational context. In marketing right now, everybody talks about the experience economy, that consumption is actually moving in a lot of ways away from products and things that, and into experiences. And that experience, providing meaningful, especially meaningful experience, is actually something with really significant economic value now. So interesting ways, again, in that kind of dialectical perspective. What I want to look at, from my own vantage point, most of my research and consulting and community work is to do with community organizations, nonprofits, and social enterprise organizations. And in that, there's another really very, very interesting story connected with some of the ideas of sustainability. So in all of our, we all know post-welfare state stuff in Canada and right through the OECD around the world, where we had lived in an environment where many of the community serving functions in society, we had sort of taken for granted that these would be, or have been for about 40 years, provided very significantly by funded, professionalized nonprofit organizations. You know, like the YMCA and all kinds, right across the board. We've also had a much longer tradition of not the community serving function, but the community building function being provided by, what's called the fourth sector, the informal or community sector. And both of those things, the empirical data is huge on this, are devolving before our eyes. So welfare state funding, we know right across the board in the OECD is plummeting as tax rates and things like that decline. For everything except medical health, right? Everything else, including our universities, you're really seeing the devolution of the public funding for community serving functions. And then led by an amazing person like Robert Putnam at Harvard, wrote an incredible book called Bowling Alone, about the decline of kind of civil and community organization in America. It's something that's been now researched right around the world, the decline of sort of social participation and informal community activities. And it's something, I mean, it's massively correlated with this affluenza. It's all over the place. So the community serving and community building functions, the way that we have both financed and organized these in our lifetime up until very recently, they're just falling apart. They're really coming apart in some very significant ways. So if this is the current in terms of sustainable society, what are some of the interesting countercurrents? So when looking at the interesting countercurrents, to think back to what was one of the most surprising things for me. 2006, so now 8 years ago, and the Nobel Peace Prize went to, you remember that? A banker, right? CEO of the Grameen Bank, right? And we're going, what the hell? It's Mandela, it's Gorbachev, a banker? And microfinance, right, emerged at that time as one of these very interesting countercurrent things, because it completely reorganized our assumptions of what we thought a bank was, right, and what a bank did, right? We all knew that banks can only make money by lending to people who don't really need it, right? If you actually really need money, banks can't make money from selling or from serving you, right? Reframed a lot of what we thought about international development, right? Because that had to be done by government funding, not run through large NGOs or small NGOs. It also reorganized what we thought about poor people and poverty, right? Well, how could you ever lend money to somebody who didn't have any? I mean, that's idiotic, right? So microfinance, a global movement spawned by challenging the assumptions that we had about these kinds of institutions. Wow. Similarly, what we're seeing in all kinds of different places right now, and this is a countercurrent that I wouldn't call anything like a movement, but it's very, very heteroglot and all over the place, is that in the vacuum of the community serving and community building functions that there are all over the place, we've got a very interesting set of developments of businesses moving into those kinds of fields. We had people even like Henry Mintzberg in Canada covered how, we've had a very, very accepted set of very sharply delimited differences between a business, a nonprofit organization, and a governmental organization for probably 50 years in Canada. Those lines have come apart. And now we're seeing a lot of really interesting examples of businesses whose business advantage, small businesses in particular, whose business advantage, whose ability to compete against large integrated mass producers is based on the business's ability to take on things like either community building or community serving functions, things that nonprofits or governments had always done, and doing them really, really well. It's interesting because if I think from a strategic perspective of the things that large integrated businesses can't do, those are some of the things which are, on one hand, vital human needs not being served. On the other side, something that large organizations have typically or traditionally been really terrible at doing. So I'm going to give a local example first of this. So in Peterborough, we have a really great outdoor retailer called Wild Rock. And Wild Rock, a locally famous thing, began as a classic, reasonably marginal, small town retailer run by people who were pretty good at retailing. And how they ended up growing was very, very interesting. They were selling things like quality bicycles. They were selling cross-country ski equipment. They were selling kayak equipment. And of course, the markets for those things are fairly small and mostly served by really, really large players. So what Kieran and Scott, the co-owners, did with this was they helped form the Peterborough Cycling Club and the North Kawartha Cross-Country Ski Club, and really supported the growth of these things. So things like clubs and participation. Peterborough now has the largest per capita cycling club in all of Canada, most active cycling club. A cycling club is a fantastic thing in a community, right? As a community building, as a health, as a non-carbon transportation, all kinds of things like that. But it's also something that has allowed this business to actually really thrive and really grow. They've probably quadrupled the size of the bicycle market in Peterborough through their involvement with the cycling club. They get to sell cycles, of course, because it's a club, and clubs and any kind of affiliate of community building activities build a lot of loyalty. So their business success has come through developing something that is a really important both community serving and community building activity. A national chain like the Running Room, I think, is another really excellent one, where sort of a small organic chain where they're trying to figure out how to compete with large integrated shoe retailers. Well, how they do it is by having running clinics and running clubs, because clinics and clubs. So businesses whose business value proposition is around building and serving communities in interesting ways. Yesterday, Don Tapscott talked about endemic youth unemployment, street-involved marginal youth in Europe. A huge issue in the UK. There's these what are called NEETs, which are young people not in education, employment, or training, NEET, and it's an acronym that everybody in the UK knows. So into that we have Jamie Oliver. You know that chef guy, right? Well, his group of 15 restaurants now, right, are really cool. He takes street-involved youth, right, and he trains street-involved youth to work in middle and high-end kitchens. And it's the value proposition for these amazing high-end restaurants. Now, in the restaurant market, the high-end restaurant market in London or in Amsterdam, where these things are located, it's a really tough place to differentiate yourself. There's millions. Well, how about by really helping people in one of the largest social needs identified in this day? So Jamie Oliver's restaurant, Series 15, there are now several of them, is at one, highly profitable in an environment where it's very difficult to be profitable, and doing something more successfully than funded nonprofit organizations working in the marginal and street-involved youth field have been doing. So I just want to have those as a couple examples, which for me are interesting ones of the ways that the currents that kind of depress us and get us mad create some very, very interesting opportunities in countercurrents that are not necessarily visible or easily visible until you start moving into them. Again, to me, less an issue of economics than perceiving opportunity. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Great examples of businesses doing community building and community serving. So I'm hoping we can continue that discussion with the audience. But we'll move to the next panelist before we. Yeah, I'll just pass it.
If I take them, it might be a better angle.
I can actually go. So next we have David Patterson. Yeah, this is David Patterson.
Thanks for not sleeping in this morning and coming to this event. We appreciate you showing up, and rather than worrying about the people that are going to be watching this 2,000 years from now on the internet, I'll come out here and talk to you directly. My voice is reaching the back of the room. I thought it might be. My daddy was a preacher, and so I ended up inheriting the voice. I'm in business, and one of the businesses that my firm is in, Northwater Capital, is we invest in small companies that are doing interesting things where they have the small companies that are rich in intellectual property. And often that ends up in the energy space, and so we think that some of the things we're doing are important in terms of reducing the carbon footprint that we all have in our society as we go forward. At the same time, we know that we're just kind of a tiny drop in the bucket. And so I want to just show you some of why that is this morning and some of the major difficulty that we're in. So I'm afraid this may not be a real feel-good speech for you this morning. But I apologize for that in advance. Now, in 1972, I graduated from here the second time in 1972, '69 the first time, and then between that I was a political activist, which was very good for helping me get a career on Bay Street. But in '72 I graduated second time, and that year was an important year in the debate on the environment, because that was the year that the limits to growth was written the first time. And that was written by the primary husband and wife team, Donella and Dennis Meadows, and a couple of other folk. But they came out of a group at MIT, actually the business school at MIT, where they developed what's called system dynamics. And since that time, the language that we've used in the environmental field has been the language of systems and language of system dynamics. So I want to just take one moment and talk a little bit about, now even from this angle, it doesn't get us there. So is it, am I pushing the wrong button?
The arrow on the right.
There we go. Oh. There we go. So, so without understanding a little bit about systems, it's very difficult to stay in the conversation about what some of the agencies are saying as to what's happening to our environment. So this is just an analogy for a system, but the analogy is of a plumbing system. And if you look at the bucket, there's water flowing into the bucket, so there's a flow. There's an accumulation at the bucket level, and then there's a way for water to flow out of the bucket. And there's information flowing from the bucket, so you can see there's a control system that is looking at the bucket and saying the bucket is almost full, we better turn off the tap. So there's a policy issue, and that analogy of where we go from the accumulation up to the control unit that decides the policy and turns off the tap or turns on the tap is being the basic way that people think about systems, especially when we're talking about the environment. So this group out of MIT, it was the key guy that developed this was Jay Forrester, was the professor, and he was the professor for a large number. Peter Senge was another one of his students. So they've had a major effect on this whole conversation around the environment. And you can see that one of the questions that happens over and over again in this in the question around the environment is how much carbon dioxide is accumulating in the air, and you can see that that's an accumulation, right? And so the question here is how do systems work? And you can create models using this approach. So we want to talk just a little bit about some of the implications of their work, and I just want to talk a slight bit about systems though first. Systems are a system is just any group of elements that work together towards a common purpose. And so the world is covered with systems. You know, university is a system. My automobile is a system. We live in a world of systems. Our heart is a system or a subsystem of our whole body. And there are basic rules that apply to every system that you find, whether it's your car or your heart. Every system has some basic rules. Systems are developed with feedback loops, so there are negative and positive feedback loops. Negative feedback loops tend to moderate something, to bring stability to a system. Positive feedback loops bring growth to a system. So the negative feedback loop pushes back against the direction that a system is going in. A positive feedback loop pushes in the same direction as a system is going, whether it's positive or negative, by the way. A positive feedback loop will push it further in that direction. So this is the kind of language that we've developed and one of the ways that we talk about these environmental issues is using this language. Now there are basic rules to systems that we have to know. And one of the rules of every system has to protect its source of energy. Every system on Earth has to have a source of energy and has to protect it, because if it doesn't protect its source of energy, think about not having any incoming resources to you for a month. You would be dead. So if you don't have a source of energy, if you don't fill up your car with gas, it stops. So any system ceases if we don't have a source of energy. Universities don't do well when they don't get funded. Businesses spend a lot of time marketing, and what they're doing is they're trying to protect their source of energy. So every system that you can find on Earth is going to obey that rule. Is we have to protect our source of energy. A second rule that every system has to obey is that every system there's a carrying capacity for the resources that are being provided to a system. So there's a limit to growth on every system on Earth. As the system develops, it approaches its carrying capacity, and it needs negative feedback loops to say, hey, you're approaching the limit here. You better go and fill up your car with gas. So your little dial-in, there's a negative feedback loop that tells me it's time to fill up my car with gas. Now, the same thing applies both to resources, i.e. sources where your system is receiving resources. That is limited, and sinks, which is where the offal from your system goes, the sources and sinks both have that dynamic, is that there's a limit. So let me just give you one, if I can. There we go. So there's a carrying capacity that every system runs into, and as you have a positive feedback loop that has growth, then you start hitting the carrying capacity. And one of the things that happens in every system is if you exceed your carrying capacity, if the positive feedback is a very strong positive feedback loop, and it exceeds the carrying capacity, then you're going into collapse. One of the examples of this that isn't a real example is, if you put rabbits in a large compound with lots of grass and things to eat, and they'll multiply, and they'll multiply and multiply and multiply, and then those rabbits will die because they'll multiply more than their food supply. So the idea is that in any system, you've got to have some negative feedback loop that says, hey, we're getting close to the carrying capacity. You'd better slow down here. You'd better stop. And so this is the language that this conversation on the environment has gone on in. And so one of the things that has happened in our society is a system, and our society, we have a very, very powerful business approach that has created a positive feedback loop. We all have sales departments in our businesses. We're all trying to make our businesses grow. And we're very, very good at it, and we're not very good at looking at the whole society. And so we have a society where these two rules of systems are in conflict. The rule that you've got to protect your energy, we're very good at protecting your energy, at the energy for our society. And we're very good at that, but then we're not very good at noticing that, hey, we need a dial that tells us, hey, we got to slow down here because we're hitting our carrying capacity. So those two rules are in deep conflict in our society. And just for fun, I thought I'd bring along a Penrose triangle, because Penrose came up with this triangle, and if you look at the Penrose triangle, and if you went in your shop and tried to build this, how would you go about doing that? But if you look at this triangle, it's kind of obvious that it's bizarre. But if you look at this triangle and just say, okay, look at this corner of the triangle, it looks perfectly good. If you look at this corner of the triangle, it looks perfectly good. If you look at this apex, it looks perfectly good. At the smaller level of the system, at the subsystem level, this triangle works perfectly. At the whole system, it doesn't work perfectly. Our business world is very much like a Penrose triangle. It's working at the subsystem, but it's not working at the whole system level. Now, Ehrlich, back a generation ago also, and I almost want to apologize to the younger folk in this crowd, because our generation blew this. We knew this, and we still didn't do anything about it. And so here we are sitting in this era, and we now have run the world into a huge jackpot. But Ehrlich came up with this formula, which he said, the impact of human activity is the size of population times the affluence times the impact per dollar of tech. So the technology in effect. So you can say the size of the population, the income of that population, and the efficiency of our technology. And so we've been improving the efficiency of our technology, and my firm is doing some things to try to improve the efficiency. For instance, we have one little company that's building super turbos that will reduce the gas consumption for large highway trucks by somewhere between 5 and 10%. That's a huge amount of gas or diesel fuel that will be saved by putting that device. But it still doesn't, and I'll show you in a second, it doesn't have much effect to improve the efficiency because of the increasing population and the increasing affluence. So the fact that we're, the two elephants in the room, as Jay Forrester would say, the two elephants in the room are population growth and growth of material manufacturing. Those are the two things that we never want to talk about. We all think that the way we get out of all of our problems is growth, and we'll just show you how well that is going to work for you. So in 1990, we were producing 21.7 billion tons of CO2 in the year. In 2007, it was 30 tons, and you just say, okay, and it's just using the same Ehrlich formula. It's just the number of people times the income times the amount of CO2. And of course, you can do this on a whole lot of things. CO2 is just one of the things that's sort of most in the news, but there are a bunch of other things, such as the pH level in the ocean. We've killed off our fish. I mean, there are dozens of these, and CO2 is just one of the issues. But you can go through and put it in the Ehrlich formula over and over again. But anyway, so we ended up with 30 billion tons of CO2, and the intergovernmental agency that's looking at climate change has basically said that we need to stabilize. We've now crossed 400 parts per million CO2 already, and at one point we thought 400 was as much as we ever wanted to go. But they're basically saying now by 2050, we need to be no more than 4 billion tons of CO2. We need to take our production down to 4 billion to have no more than 450. And 450 is an estimate that we're going to be okay, but it's just an estimate. We may not even be okay at 450. But even to stabilize at 450, we're now at 400. And it's up 26 or 30% or something like that over the last couple of decades. we need to stabilize at 4 billion. Now, if you say, okay, well, what's the population going to be in 2050? It looks like the population is going to be somewhere around 10 or 10.1 billion. It's going to have an income, you know, maybe if we slow down the income growth, it'll be 7,500. And maybe if we improve our efficiency, we can have it at 500. So that looks like 38 billion. And so you do the math and say, how are you going to move any one of these numbers to make those two numbers the same, 4 billion or 38 billion? How is it going to happen? So it's obvious to me that this isn't going to happen, that we are going to run into a wall. And so that's the negative thing that I said, you're going to go home, you know, that this isn't a great positive speech. The one thing that I think, you know, people normally in my situation will tell you, oh, no, we're going to bring new technology and we're going to beat this with new technology, and we're not going to beat this with new technology. This is only a few years away. It's not possible to beat this with new technology. It's not possible to have this big a shift in our society, so we are running ourselves into a wall. And I'm sorry to bring you the news, but very few people actually admit this, but we are running ourselves into a wall. And our generation has done this because, like I said, we knew this in 1972. So, my sense as to, well, where is there a way out of this? There's maybe one way out of this, and that is, we now have the physical capability to communicate around the world instantly to almost all people that are at least involved in the consuming society. I have an iPad, many of you have an iPad, and that's a new thing in the world. Many times in history, there's been a major change in self-understanding as to what a human being is. And it seems to me that what we need here is a new understanding of what a human being is. One of the things that creates the consumer society is our own anxiety, our own sense of ourself. That's what sells and creates something that's what creates momentum. If you look at advertising on the TV, you'll know that what they're trying to do is create anxiety in you so that you can buy the latest cream to put on your face or whatever. It's creating anxiety. And so what we need is a new understanding, a new self-understanding of who we are as human beings and what society is as human beings. And that has happened many times in the world. I mean, let me just, if you think of the Renaissance, before the Renaissance, after the Renaissance, there was a major shift in the understanding of us as human beings. If you think of the Reformation, before the Reformation, after the Reformation. If you think of the ruins at Angkor Wat, obviously at Angkor Wat there was an outburst of humanness that there was a new understanding of what it meant to be a human being, and you had that happen. Now, in the past, the spread of a new idea of what it means to be a human being took decades and decades. The spread of Buddhism across Asia, it took hundreds of years for Buddhism to spread across Asia. The fusion was very slow. Now, when we all have iPads, it's possible for there to be a brand new understanding very quickly. And to me, that's the great source of hope for me, is that one of these days we're going to wake up to what the formulas are telling us. And we're going to say, no, we've got to be different as human beings. We can't do what we've done. Got to stop. Sorry if it takes so long.
Thank you, David. Next we have David Newhouse.
Is this on? I don't have a green light.
It's on.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you
Okay.
just pull it a little closer to you.
A little closer, okay. I don't speak very loud, so I don't. My father was not a minister. I want to start, I think, with a story about Trent, as Ray started the story about Trent as well. First of all, I came to Trent in February 1973 for a conference that was organized by the Public Service of Canada, who chose Trent as a site to try to bring Aboriginal students together. Back then we called them Indian students. And, so they brought about 40 of us together to Trent for a weekend to try to entice us to work in the Public Service of Canada. I met members of the Native Studies Department at that point and was quite appalled at what I saw, and with a great emphasis upon culture and tradition. And I left at the end of the weekend vowing never to return to Trent and believing that Trent was going in the wrong direction. And I found myself 20 years later at the heart of the enterprise, and as a chair of the department that I had not thought was going in the right direction. So I think in your life, never say never, right? And so all things are possible. So I'm not quite as pessimistic as David is here as well. But I also want to thank Asaf for inviting me to step in at the last moment. Before I talk, I want to give you a sense of what I've been doing. I served as the chair, or not the chair, as a member of the policy team on economics for the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. And so I had an opportunity to begin to think about economics and Aboriginal people and the system that we work within. Secondly, I also worked with an organization called CANDO, the Council for the Advancement of Native Development Officers, which then began to train economic development officers right across the country as well, and we developed a certification program. I worked for the Department of Indian Northern Affairs in the 1980s as the director of Indian housing policy. My job as the director was to modernize the Indian housing policy. And what that meant, because the Conservative government had just been elected, was to develop market solutions for Indian housing. As all of you know, housing on Indian reserves across the country is a very large problem, and the solution to the problem exceeds our capacity as a public to provide resources for Indian housing. And so the idea was to try to create market solutions. And so my job was to create an Indian housing market on Indian reserves. That's an incredible challenge. And I don't know whether any of you have ever had the opportunity to create a market. It's not easy. It's one of the most difficult things you can do. It's an act of social engineering. Because what I discovered, right, was that in order to create a market, I had to begin to change the way in which people saw their lives. And I had to begin to change the way in which they related to each other and how they related to housing, their homes. They had to begin to see their homes, their houses as commodities. And I also had to begin to develop instruments of ownership, because the issues of the market instruments that we use to talk about ownership, about transferability, don't exist in that environment. So there's no market institutions. And so I began to see the economic system that we call capitalism, right, as not just an economic system, but as a socio-economic political system that require a moral commitment to make it work. I'm working now, right, with the Babaton First Nation community, located 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, a fly-in community. And my job in that place is try to help to find ways to alleviate poverty. And the solution, again, is to try to create markets and help people to prepare to participate in the market because they're located next to the Ring of Fire. And as all of you know, those mineral deposits of chromium are incredible. And so I'm facing a moral dilemma again, right? They want to participate, but it requires enormous changes to their life, right? To their way of thinking about themselves. They have tried market solutions for the last 80 years, and none of them have worked at all. Right? No market solutions in that area have worked. They were at one point known as the Paris of the North. They were a place where the Treaty 9 was signed, and they had great promise. But none of the market solutions are working because it requires them to engage in a set of behaviors that are not part of their culture. It requires them to begin to think about themselves as competitive human beings. And that's not who they are. Honest agriculture is about collaboration. I'm Iroquoian, right, and we call ourselves Haudenosaunee. And we have a story about the creation of the world. Right? A woman, right, in the sky world falls through a hole. Some say she's pushed by her husband, but that's another story. But she falls through the hole, and right, as she falls, right, the birds, right, come to her rescue, and the animals, right, in the water of the earth begin to dive in order to create the earth. They dive to get bits and pieces of the earth and begin to build the earth. And so the story is an incredible story about collaboration. It's not a story about competition. The Anishinaabe have a similar story. And so at the heart of indigenous cultures is this impulse towards collaboration, not an impulse towards competition, which a capitalist system requires. And so, how do you begin, right, to educate people, right, in this issue of collaboration? Because we live in a sea of institutions. We live in a sea of ideas, right? And we create institutions that express our ideas and put them in action. Our institutions reflect what we think is important. This institution teaches economics. It teaches classical economics. If I bring in someone from Ibamangtang into a classical economics course, they're going to say, what is all this about, right? It's going to be completely and totally alien. If I educate them, right, in that system, and then they go back, they're not going to be able to function at all. They can't function in that society because the behaviors that the educational system will have given them, right, would make it difficult for them as well. And so when we begin to talk about issues of sustainability, we begin to talk about issues, right, of long-term sustainability. How do we begin to bring those into the system, into this institution? We have to bring them into these institutions and make them part of the curriculum. And so my message, I guess, today is that we need to begin to shape the institution, the education institution, so that we begin to bring in a new set of ideas that help us to collaborate, that help us to think differently about ourselves, as David said. I'm cross-appointed in the business administration program, and I delight in bringing new ideas into that environment. I delight in creating a great deal of disconsternation among my students, right, as well.
And colleagues.
And colleagues, and I tell my fourth-year students in a course which I teach called Management Thought, that they are agents of capitalism, that the role of manager in a business organization is to advance the project of capitalism, that their job, right, is to make capitalism work for them and to work better and to create benefits for them. And so they are not individual actors pursuing their own individual dreams, but they are part of a larger social, cultural, economic drama over which they have no control. And it scares the hell out of them. And they don't know what to do, because they've all seen themselves as self-defining, right, individuals who are pursuing, right, a individual dream that they would like, and that's partly correct as well. Now the creation story also says that they are part of a community. Collaboration requires community. Collaboration requires a sense of connectedness. And so I asked them to do this exercise in which I have them place themselves at the center. And then, right, around them, I asked them to draw a circle and list every individual that has helped them to get where they are. And then they have to go and thank them individually, in person. And it's a profound experience for them. They begin to see themselves differently as part of a community. They're not single, solitary actors. And so those are the type of ideas that we need to begin to bring right into the educational system, that begin to inform right, our students so they can go and begin to make the change. Because the change, right, that David was talking about is not going to occur right, without institutional support. We can get bits and pieces of it, as Ray Darts has suggested. Right? Social enterprise is a response to people's felt inadequacy about the economic system that they're part of. It helps them to create a sense of meaning. We also need to have a sense of meaning in our lives. That we are not just consuming beings who worship the market. There's a lot of literature these days that talk about how we are right now right, thinking of the market right, as a live entity, right? And we think that animism is dead, right? Just listen to all the discussion about the market, right? It's a human being. The market thinks, the market moves, the market senses, right? And we react to it as well. We don't see ourselves as having created it, as being part of it. And so it's those ideas, right, that I think that we need to begin to bring into the economic arena. The idea of collaboration, the idea that we are part of something larger, the idea that we need to begin to think, right, for longer than just a quarter as well. Right? And so there are now right, 26,000 or so average small businesses right across the country. Every First Nation now has an economic development plan, and they're all beginning to deal with these issues. of how do you begin to use these ideas that come from our own cultural heritage, our own cultural intellectual heritage, right, as the basis for informing. This idea of collaboration. This is the Conceptual Economic Management Corporation, right? And then it looks, right, like a conglomerate, but it's a network. It's a network of companies. It's a network of organizations that are trying to operate, right, according to Aboriginal principles. This idea of collaboration, this idea of duty to benefit, this idea of restraint. Right? Our economic system doesn't at all suggest that we should operate with restraint as well. Unamakity Economic Development, this is in Cape Breton. Right? Imaki is the Mi'kmaq word for Cape Breton, right, around Sydney, okay, as well. Right? And there, again, they focused upon collaboration. They focused upon partnerships and networks. Right? And if you look at their network, you'll see that it's quite broad. It doesn't just include business corporation. It includes universities. It includes colleges. Right? It also includes the tar ponds cleanup. They're a part of utility service and paper mills. Right? And so they're all trying to begin to and they're working with Cape Breton University. Right? They have a chair in Aboriginal business who is beginning to work, right, on Mi'kmaq ideas about business as well. Right? And this is the organization that I've been working with for the last 3 years, the Council for the Advancement of Native Development Officers. And we put together a certification program that is, I guess, a network, right, of universities across the country in which we selected courses that fit our philosophy. And so that the students who receive a certification as an economic development officer or an Aboriginal economic development officer, right, have a foundation of Aboriginal thought as well. And now, we do also within the Indigenous community, right, have a set of institutions that help us to think about the long term, right? And my great-grandfather, Seth Newhouse, translated the Guidance Synagogue, the Great Law of Peace, into English, and he wrote it in wampums, which I call wampum clauses, as a way of talking to the English, who were utterly and totally convinced that we did not have a system of governance. And wampum number 28, and this is just a paraphrase, talks a bit about the instructions to chiefs. So when you are selected as a chief, right, there's a process, right? And the instructions at your investiture go a bit like this. Your heart should be filled with peace and goodwill, and your mind filled with yearning for the welfare of the people of the Confederacy. And I keep wondering at times if, in fact, Stephen Harper's, if we should apply the same leadership standards to Stephen Harper and Rob Ford, if in fact, I like the term yearning, that's an old one. Okay. And the last one I think is quite interesting. Look and listen for the welfare of the whole people, and always have in view not only the present but also the coming generations, even those faces are yet beneath the surface of the ground, the unborn of the future nation. Right? And this is the infamous 7 generations clause, right? That in all your deliberations, think of the effect upon your behavior upon 7 generations of people. I mean, that's an incredible standard to apply, right? It may, right, in fact, force you to consider some things that you might not, and force some notion of restraint. It may help David with some of his challenge, right, as well. But that's an incredible leadership standard to begin to use, right, as well. There is also in Indigenous thought this idea, and this is from the Anishinaabe, the idea of Bimopsalan, or Minobimopsalan, the idea of a good life. Right? And the good life is a life that is balanced, right, between sort of the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual. And so if one is beginning to talk in terms of economics, right, that it includes not just the material that we think about, but also includes the cultural, right, the social, and the spiritual. Right? And these ideas are beginning to be used, right, as the basis for institutional action within Indigenous communities, right, as well. And I want to finish with at least the way in which Dan Longboat, who teaches in the Indigenous Environmental Studies program here, says that we ought to begin to teach our economics, right? He says, and what we ought to do is just that we teach people about the relationship, right, between themselves and the environment, and teach people that there is that environment. And he says, and give a man a fish, and you feed him for a day. Give a man, teach a man to fish, and he has fish for a lifetime. Right? Teach a man about his relationship to fish, and you have fish for men for the end of time. And it's that last bit, right, that I think that we need to begin to include more and more in our institutional action, right, in the educational system. That is extremely important. We know a great deal about fish, we don't know a great deal about a relationship to fish as well. He says if we focus upon that, right, then we will begin to create a sustainable human and animal environment. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say right now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Lastly, we have Asaf, our third honorary David.
Excellent. Okay. I've been following the sessions on sustainability for the last couple of days, and there's a lot that has been thrown out here in terms of how do we make sense of this. And sadly, having really spent the majority of my career dealing with sustainability-related issues, I've seen this spaghetti before. It can be very, very overwhelming. In terms of the overwhelming dimensions that we've talked about so far, we got introduced to Paul Simon early on in terms of satisficing the need for irrationality as a fundamental premise for understanding why we don't understand. Ray talked about a whole need of merging constellations and ideas, of mixing hybrid forms of organization as a way forward, and basically doing things very differently from the way we've done them up until now as the way to move forward. Dave, you introduced us to the very, very simple issue of new understandings of what it means to be a human being. That's a pretty deep question. It's a pretty, I find it a very intimidating and difficult question to deal with. But you're right, to get at the root problems, we have to ask big questions. My colleague, Professor Newhouse, David, you've said we need new standards of leadership. Fundamental change in social and economic policy. How do we make sense of this configuration? I'm going to do that in around 10 minutes or less. But I'm going to need your help. And according to the science, because I think there's a science side and there's a human side. The science tells me you've been sitting in one place for an hour and 20 minutes. It's time for a body break. So I would suggest that everybody gets up, stretches a little bit. Okay, don't be intimidated by this. We'll take care of this. I think some of the problem in terms of what is the answer is that we do have a lot of stuff in place that helps us try to make sense of complexity. To make sense of, for example, we talk about systems thinking. So we've got J. Forrester systems, and they developed a whole language through which we can talk about really, really complex stuff. And it's called systems thinking, and Peter Senge also was one of my great heroes, and one of the ways through which systems thinking operates is to chart out things in negative. I'm just trying to pull together some ideas based on what my colleagues did. And has anybody ever seen the spaghetti slide before? Okay, this is called a spaghetti slide. It's really, really well known because this slide was presented at a briefing in Afghanistan by the U.S. military. Yeah, it was presented at a briefing, and a major general who shall not be named.
It would have been a long briefing.
It was going to be a long briefing, who shall not be named because he later had to step aside because of other things that were happening in his life from a holistic perspective. He took one look at this and he said, that's it. No more PowerPoint in military briefings. One of the sad ironies of the human condition is we have to look to the military for innovation. Okay? So what we have here is actually a really, really good slide because they were trying to figure out how do we address this issue. And they tried to apply systems thinking to the issue of Afghanistan. There are social issues, there are political issues, there are environmental issues, there are cultural issues. And the military understood that if we take a certain military strategic action, it will have implications and reverberate throughout the system. Now the problem is this is totally overwhelming. Right? It is a rhetorical statement. This is also a professional problem for us as academics. Because there's nothing we love more as a culture than to analyze things to death. And it not always leads to a substantive end in terms of what do we do. But I think one thing that's not really understood in terms of where to take systems thinking is that systems thinking as a way of dealing with complex systems and self-organization and emergent order, it offers us techniques to break down complexity into component parts and then to reconfigure them in ways that can be understood. And I think we're in dire need of how do we get from here to a source of positive action. And most important than anything else, and I guess this to me I think is what I heard because especially my colleague Suresh is here. He was speaking on a panel with Bob Page and Stephen Hill yesterday. And there was a really profound question that was asked. Is that if we look at all of the issues talked about in terms of sustainability, and I just offered you a random, the answer's not buried here, this is actually pretty random in terms of terms, like what is your narrative? What is the storyline that will engage people and actually make the kind of transformational changes that we heard about here in terms of our inherent understanding of how to even begin to address issues and to make sense of issues? You need a clear narrative. And to develop a clear narrative for me, what you need is a clear sense of what is my sphere of influence. What can I actually take care of? And when we begin analysis that takes us here, this is where we get overwhelmed and we say, no, the problems are too big. And I actually think the problems are not really that big. The solutions demand very, very big fundamental changes. And I think each and every one of my colleagues have mentioned those changes. And those changes relate to values. They relate to the fundamental ways through which we value issues. Right? We do a lot of this stuff, in my mind, because we want to avoid the fundamental question. We talked about we left a mess as a generation for the next generation. I think we've been experts at avoiding the big questions. And the big question, this stuff looks different if you get at the fundamental series of values that dictate and inform the way we see issues. And the way we see issues dictates how we frame the dynamics. This panel is supposed to be about economics. Now, my father was an economist. We didn't agree on a lot of things, but the basic thing that he let me understand about economics, he says economics is a science on how we give value and get value from stuff. That's basically what economics is, right? And we've given economics a pretty rough ride in the sense of, oh, look at the system, especially within my genre of sustainability. Traditional economics doesn't really value, they take all the things we really value, they make them externalities. Well, folks, we're complicit in that because we are the ones who have ownership over what is given value and what is not given value. One of the greatest things that I enjoy doing in Trent as a professor of business who came here 13 years ago from the Schulich School is I have to, first of all, get the undergrad students to accept the fact that folks from corporations and from businesses are not people out there who are evil people. I say, how many people have parents that don't work in organizations? And very few, everybody does, so we all know them. So I've seen the enemy about externalities, and the enemy is us in that regard, okay? So I'm just gonna try to pull a couple of ideas together in terms of where I think we can take a conversation, because I just wanna, in the next 7-8 minutes, build a bridge to a conversation. And I urge that conversation not to be about questions to the panel, but about answers that you want to offer for us to discuss about where we need to go to develop that narrative and to really reposition some of these issues in a way that will lead forward. So, what is the fundamental rationale in terms of why should businesses look at different economic models and strive for a greater sense of sustainability? Right? Well, it's to do the right thing, right? A business should be doing the right thing. He's in a business where they want to invest in other businesses that do the right thing. Do you think the majority of businesses do it because it's the right thing to do?
It depends on their description of what the right thing is for themselves as business.
For themselves. So they've got to have the right thing to do is not just because of a value or a moral, it's got to have some kind of instrumental thing, right? So basically there needs to be a business case, okay? Most businesses that I deal with, when I do facilitation and consulting, is they need to have a clear business case, because if they don't have a clear business case, they're sure, yeah, exactly, right? So, and it's got to be fast. It's got to be very, very quick, okay? So, some folks frame it as the cost of doing business, okay? So, we have stages and phases. Legal compliance. Most organizations that I deal with do it as a form of risk management, if you will. They adopt sustainable strategies because they don't want to get into trouble. They don't want to get sued, right? Very few have the insight and the courage to step beyond that and to say, no, wait a minute. This issue of sustainability is actually a series of opportunities, and this is where my colleague Ray Dart comes in. He says, no. It's not to avoid doing harm. It's not to avoid getting caught. There are a whole bunch of really new opportunities out there that we never really realized, right? You talked about British youth. It was neat, right?
Yep.
Okay? So that's basically saying, through a framework of sustainable business practices, there is a business case for engaging new kinds of enterprise that are not possible if you define economic in terms of short-term financial return to shareholder, right? And this is where things get exciting, right? We begin to open up a whole bunch of different opportunities around the fact that we can do a business where there hasn't been a business before. Bilal, you're here from Save the Children. You guys are actually doing business that makes a difference at the same time in order to support free children, right?
So, one comment I should add before we talk about the work with the children.
Yep.
I mentioned that we work with a lot of corporations that are redefining corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, you have to speak up because this is a top-down room where the acoustics are only for conversation this way.
My intention, but I just want to add a comment about another dimension why corporations are trying to redefine the corporate social responsibility is actually the government, the business cases that are coming to us as a charity. We work with them and how we can continue to attract talent and also retain your own talent. They know
Absolutely perfect. Thank you for sharing that. This is the point in terms of, first of all, you began by saying, well, wait a minute, there are new emerging sources of value that corporations, in particular, are looking to nonprofits to say, how do you get that kind of culture of commitment? How do you get that kind of employee loyalty, right? So it's very much, there's a business case for doing so, right? So one of our challenges in moving to sustainability is giving proper valuation to stuff that we didn't value before. And sometimes that valuation also involves the absence of doing harm, right? So basically, we're looking at consumers that may actually be valuing more products that, while financially may cost more, but do less harm. They're made from organic product. They're made from product that does less harm to the environment, more socially responsible product, right? So, new sources of value. There's two more things I just want to introduce, and then I'm just going to throw it open to folks to jump into. This, by the way, is a slide I just put up for students who I know. You've missed this model so much.
So much.
Emily, it's been a good 2 years since you've seen this. I thought I'd bring it home just for you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. So basically, unless you didn't know, in business administration, there is no problem in the world that can't be solved by a 2x2. We don't need systems thinking. We just put it at a 2x2. So I'm going to quickly give you this 2x2 and tell you where it adds value and where it needs to add more value. And then I'm going to kick it over to you for questions. Okay, so simple model, 2x2. The environment is made up of things inside the organization and outside the organization, right? And we're looking at time frames in terms of today to tomorrow. In terms of the external environment in today, you get your legitimacy or license to operate, right, by engaging your stakeholders. And this is where a lot of stuff has been happening in terms of organizations doing it right or doing it absolutely very wrong. Okay? There's another Dave Patterson that was co-chair with me of the Trent Business Council. He came from Johnson & Johnson, right? And there's the famous Tylenol story from them. They started this a good 25, 30 years ago. And it's a company that, in terms of engaging its stakeholders, was committed to saying, we will always only do stuff that we will give our own employees and our own families before we go outside. So they regularly engage their employees and basically frame themselves, Johnson & Johnson, as a big successful corporation. They basically invented stakeholder engagement as a source of value. So we're talking about this movement in corporations that we actually actively engage our stakeholders and not just our shareholders. And it's not done altruistically necessarily. It's done because there's new sources of value by engaging those that have a stake in the organization. Right? So this is the transition to the stakeholder organization versus the shareholder-based organization. This has been a bumpy road, right? It's not always rewarded by the markets if we do that correctly. In terms of today, the other dimension, is internal short-term. Most organizations that I work with, they use this dimension as a way of catching low-hanging fruit, right? Install energy efficiency light bulbs, for example, as a way of reducing energy costs right away. But basically, this dimension today internally is how you engage the members of the organization to do stuff. Has anybody ever heard of Interface? Interface and Ray Anderson? I had the huge privilege of actually working with him. He passed away, unfortunately. One of the giants of the sustainability movement, hardcore engineering guy, that was asked one day by his, very briefly because I know I'm running late on time here, he was asked by his clients to come up with something on sustainability, and he had absolutely no idea what to do. He did some reading, he got a new vision, but more than anything else, he went internally to his employees, and he just told his employees are all engineers, they make carpets, right? He said, I need solutions to this. And they said, fine, good, you're giving this to me, it's an engineering problem. Within half a year, 30% reduction in waste, 20% savings in terms of energy. Supply chain management improved by another 25 to 30%. Why? Because they're engineers. They were given a problem, and they were told it's a priority. Right? That's what happens internally today. In terms of innovation, it became a strategic focus saying, we are going to do this. Ray Anderson said, within 10 years, I will have zero waste. So actually, how do we do that? Right? So the way they did it at Interface, I hope I'm not boring those that know the story, because I'm old school. This is the archetype of how you make an organization sustainable and you reward shareholders and stakeholders. They basically said, we're no longer making carpet the way we used to. As a matter of fact, let's begin with this. We have zero waste because we recycle everything. Whatever we give to the client in terms of a carpet, we are going to take back when they're done using it because we have no more raw materials. There's nothing that goes out that doesn't go back in. Right? That actually changed in terms of innovation. His salespeople said, well, wait a minute. We don't want to be in the business of actually selling carpets anymore. We're basically going to own the carpet forever. So Interface doesn't sell you a carpet anymore. They will rent you a carpet because they say the raw material belongs to us because we have to make new carpet. You can buy it for 15 years if you wish, but we own this. A sales said, oh, you know what? I now have a 15-year relationship in an industry where it's a McDonald's in terms of customers. I don't have to go out and get new business because business comes back to me because I got a hook with my client. So now we have to reconfigure in a business of carpet, right? Who would have thought? You sell a carpet, what's your name? 5 minutes after you bought a product, nobody knows you as a customer. Now they have 15-year relationships with them. Okay? So the issue of technical efficiency and creating zero waste creates an entire new business paradigm for Interface. They no longer sell, they rent. By being in 15-year relationships, they're perfectly aligned for how to give value, economics, back to the customer. Forever. Right? So they've revolutionized the business model. Where this stuff begins, it begins up here. Tomorrow, external. What is your vision? Right? Ray Anderson, as an individual entrepreneur, cell phone company, he later went public, basically said, I'm going to change it. This is how I'm going to run my business. Right? So it needs that kind of consistent, clear narrative that we were talking about yesterday and in Suresh's session that says, we are going to transform this, and the vision is, within X amount of years, zero waste. And he made it happen, and that's the model. Okay? I'm just going to conclude and then open it up to discussions. We talked a lot about this panel and the days before about change. And about, this is actually the Primrose Triangle. Escher took that technique and basically made a career out of it.
I almost bought one of
It's the same thing. We actually didn't plan this. I didn't pay him for this. So because this is where systems thinking takes us. Systems thinking takes us to platforms that say, in order to, systems don't change and transform quantumly. They do so incrementally. Through critical mass in small parts of the system, and this is what David Baum talks as one of the students of Jay Forrester, is that we take small changes and they accumulate to create large effects. To me, this is a very, very empowering vision in terms of what does the visual of systemic change look like? Because this change can't happen unless there's a critical mass of folks, each and every one of us, in their own sphere of influence. And I'm not just talking about corporations, I'm talking about consumers working with corporations to redefine jointly value. Right? One step at a time, and after a while you get the transformation. You get a CEO of a carpet company that's told to come up with a vision on change, and he moves down, he asks his employees, his engineers, make it so, and they make small changes in production, which leads sales to reconfigure and say, I'm not selling carpet, I'm leasing it. I want to own the raw material for 100%. All of a sudden, they end up as the top sustainability company in an industry that's known as a huge polluter, that every other industry comes and learns from. That's how systemic change unfolds. That's how value propositions are offered and then absorbed and rewarded by the market. The only thing I want to say about this, and again, back to David Baum. David Baum said, the way this process works is not just about technologies. And this is getting very much to what the two Davids had to say about this. We need not only conversations. The process of change with us as a species goes through the way we relate to each other. The way we relate to each other is how we engage each other in meaningful conversation. We need qualitatively different kinds of conversations to really make this continue to flow, and not just to stop at the level of greenwash, or at the level of espoused versus enacted, at the level of a BP, that 1 month before the big disaster in the Gulf, I was teaching in a classroom saying they are best practices in the industry because they complied with all the best practices in the industry until the Gulf blew up. So that conversation requires a qualitatively different kind of speaking, but above all, and I think this is exactly where Anishinaabe insights and IK insights take us, we need a fundamentally different way of listening to each other and acknowledging each other like David's circle, like what we saw in terms of wampum 1028. We need a different way of hearing, we need a different way of listening, and that is the only way through which we're going to have a fundamentally different way of acting. Sorry for going over time.